Picture this. It's 3 in the morning. The sterile corridors of the hospital are dimly lit, and the only sounds are the distant hum of machines keeping someone alive down the hall. But then you hear it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. You look around. There's no one there. The footsteps stop. Then you hear a voice calling for help from a room that's been empty for months. Welcome to the world of America's most haunted hospitals, where the line between life and death becomes terrifyingly thin. Tonight, I'm taking you inside 5 medical facilities where the spirits of the past refuse to let go. These aren't just old buildings with creaky floors. These are places where human suffering reached its peak, where desperate prayers went unanswered, and where some souls decided to stay behind long after their bodies gave up. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about what happens when we die. 5 hospitals, 5 terrifying encounters, 5 stories that will follow you into your dreams tonight. But before we begin this journey into the darkness, let me warn you. Once you hear these stories, you'll never look at hospitals the same way again. Are you ready to discover why some places never truly let their patients leave? Let's begin with our first destination, a place where the screams of the past still echo through empty rooms. There are some stories that were never meant to be told, some secrets that governments spend billions to keep buried, some places that exist in the spaces between official records, funded by black budgets and operated by people whose names have been erased from every database. What I'm about to share with you violates multiple federal laws and could result in my disappearance if the wrong people discover I know these details. The facility has no official name. In classified documents, it's referred to only as Site 47 or sometimes Project Mindbridge. But those who worked there before it was hastily abandoned in 1983 called it something else. They called it the Gateway, and what they opened there should have remained closed forever. The facility was built in 1967 in the remote wilderness of northern Montana, disguised as a private psychiatric research hospital. The official cover story claimed it was developing new treatments for severe mental illness using cutting-edge technology. The reality was far more sinister. Project Mindbridge was a joint operation between the CIA, the Department of Defense, and contractors whose identities remain classified to this day. Their goal wasn't to cure mental illness. It was to weaponize human consciousness itself. Dr. Amanda Winters was recruited for the project in 1981, 2 years before everything went catastrophically wrong. Amanda was a brilliant neuroscientist who had been developing revolutionary techniques for mapping brain activity in real time. She thought she was being recruited to help develop treatments for soldiers suffering from severe PTSD. She had no idea she was being brought in to clean up the aftermath of experiments that had already torn holes in the fabric of reality itself. The facility was built like a fortress, surrounded by electrified fences and patrolled by guards who shot first and asked questions never. The main building was constructed entirely underground, buried beneath 50 feet of concrete and steel. Official records claimed this was for security purposes, to protect sensitive research from foreign espionage. The truth was that they needed the containment. What they were dealing with couldn't be allowed to reach the surface. Amanda's first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came during her initial briefing with the project director, a man who identified himself only as Colonel Hayes. Hayes was a career military officer with dead eyes and hands that never stopped shaking. When he showed Amanda the patient files, she realized she wasn't looking at medical records. She was looking at casualty reports. The patients weren't suffering from conventional mental illness. They were the survivors of previous experiments, individuals whose minds had been artificially expanded beyond the normal limitations of human consciousness. The procedures had granted them abilities that defied scientific explanation. Telepathy, precognition, the ability to influence matter with thought alone. But the human brain wasn't designed to process such capabilities, and the results were invariably catastrophic. Patient after patient had descended into a form of madness that went beyond anything in psychiatric literature. They spoke of seeing through the walls between dimensions, of communicating with entities that existed in spaces between atoms. They described realities layered on top of our own like transparent sheets, each one containing horrors that human language couldn't adequately describe. But the most disturbing cases were the patients who had gained the ability to project their consciousness outside their physical bodies. They could travel to distant locations, observe events happening thousands of miles away, and gather intelligence that proved invaluable to their military handlers. The problem was that they weren't traveling alone. Something was following them back. Colonel Hayes led Amanda deeper into the facility, past security checkpoints that required biometric scans and armed guards who watched their every movement. The lower levels housed the patients in specially constructed cells that were more like bunkers than medical rooms. Each cell was lined with a metallic mesh that Amanda was told would contain electromagnetic fields. She later learned it was designed to contain something far worse than electromagnetic energy. The first patient Amanda examined was a former Navy SEAL named Marcus Webb. Marcus had volunteered for the consciousness projection experiments in 1979, hoping to develop reconnaissance abilities that could save the lives of his fellow soldiers. The procedures had been successful beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Marcus could project his consciousness anywhere on Earth with perfect accuracy. He could observe enemy installations, eavesdrop on classified conversations, and gather intelligence that no conventional spy could obtain. But Marcus was no longer entirely Marcus. When Amanda entered his cell, she found him sitting in a corner, his eyes focused on something she couldn't see. He was having a conversation with someone who wasn't there, speaking in a language that hurt her ears to hear. The words seemed to bypass her auditory processing and attack her brain directly, causing stabbing headaches and visual distortions. Marcus looked at Amanda with eyes that held depths no human gaze should contain. Behind his pupils, she could see something else looking back at her. Something that had learned to wear Marcus Webb like a suit of clothes. "You're the new doctor," Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple people speaking in perfect unison. "They brought you here to fix us. But you can't fix what we've become. We've seen too much. We've gone too far. And we've brought back passengers." Amanda tried to maintain her professional composure, but every instinct was screaming at her to run from this room and never return. Marcus continued speaking, but his voice kept shifting, sometimes sounding like himself and sometimes carrying inflections that belonged to something else entirely. "The things we found in the spaces between thoughts," Marcus continued. "They've been waiting for someone to open the door. Consciousness projection isn't just about moving your mind to another location. It's about moving through dimensions that exist parallel to our own. And some of those dimensions are occupied." Over the following weeks, Amanda examined dozens of patients who had been subjected to various consciousness expansion experiments. Each case was more disturbing than the last. Patients who could read minds but were driven insane by the constant bombardment of other people's thoughts. Individuals who could see the future but were tormented by visions of disasters they were powerless to prevent. People who could influence physical matter with their minds but couldn't control what they were influencing. But the worst cases were the possession victims. Patients whose expanded consciousness had attracted the attention of entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions. These beings were ancient beyond human comprehension, and they had been searching for millennia for a way to enter our reality. The consciousness projection experiments had provided them with the perfect opportunity. The possessed patients retained their human appearance, but their personalities were completely dominated by alien intelligences. They spoke of realities where physics worked differently, where time moved in spirals rather than lines, where consciousness was the fundamental building block of existence. They described their home dimension as a place of pure thought, where matter was merely a temporary inconvenience that could be manipulated at will. Dr. Winters discovered that the entities weren't just possessing individual patients. They were using the possessed individuals as anchor points, gradually expanding their influence throughout the facility. Guards began reporting equipment malfunctions that followed no logical pattern. Electronic devices would function normally for days and then suddenly display impossible readings. Cameras would show empty corridors that guards could clearly see were occupied by moving figures. The breaking point came on March 15, 1983, when Patient Zero achieved full dimensional breach. Patient Zero was a former astronaut named David Morrison who had been subjected to the most intensive consciousness expansion procedures ever attempted. The goal was to see if human consciousness could survive and function in the vacuum of space, potentially allowing for instantaneous communication across vast distances. The experiment succeeded beyond their wildest nightmares. David's consciousness didn't just survive in the void between dimensions. It thrived there, and when it returned to his physical body, it brought back something that had been waiting in the darkness for someone to show it the way home. Amanda was in the observation room when David achieved full manifestation. His physical body remained restrained on the examination table, but the air around him began to shimmer and distort. Temperature readings spiked and then dropped to levels that should have been impossible in a controlled environment. And then the entity that had been riding piggyback on David's consciousness finally materialized in our reality. It was beautiful and terrible, a geometric form that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human vision could process. Looking at it directly caused intense disorientation, as if her brain was trying to understand something that violated every assumption about how reality functioned. The entity pulsed with colors that had no names, and its movement through three-dimensional space left trails of distortion that lingered long after it had passed. But the most horrifying aspect wasn't what the entity looked like. It was what it did to everyone in its presence. Every person in the observation room began to experience consciousness expansion whether they wanted it or not. Amanda suddenly found herself aware of the thoughts and emotions of everyone around her. She could feel the terror radiating from the guards, the desperate attempts at rationalization from the other researchers, and underlying it all, a sense of hungry anticipation from the entity itself. The entity spoke without words, its communication bypassing language entirely and inserting concepts directly into their minds. It expressed gratitude for being shown the way into this reality. It promised to bring its entire species through the dimensional breach that David Morrison's consciousness had created. It explained that Earth would serve as a perfect staging ground for expanding into other realities, other dimensions where more primitive species waited to be enlightened. Amanda managed to activate the facility's emergency containment protocols, flooding David Morrison's examination room with electromagnetic pulses designed to disrupt paranormal manifestations. The entity flickered and distorted, its beautiful geometric form becoming unstable. But even as it faded back into whatever dimension it had come from, Amanda could feel its amusement at their primitive attempts to contain it. The entity's parting message was burned into every mind present. We know the way now. The door has been opened. We will return with others. Project Mindbridge was terminated immediately. The facility was sealed and classified beyond top secret. Every researcher who had worked there was transferred to other projects or encouraged to take early retirement. The official records were destroyed, and new cover stories were created to explain the sudden abandonment of what had supposedly been a psychiatric research hospital. But Amanda Winters kept copies of her research notes, hidden in places where government agents would never think to look. She documented everything she had witnessed, every patient she had examined, every impossible manifestation she had observed, and she kept track of the signs that the entities from the spaces between dimensions hadn't forgotten about Earth. strange electromagnetic anomalies that appear near former test sites, military personnel who develop impossible abilities and then disappear into classified programs, reports of consciousness projection experiments being conducted in facilities that officially don't exist. All evidence that Project Mindbridge wasn't terminated but was simply moved deeper underground. Its research continued by people who believe they can control forces beyond human comprehension. Amanda died in 2019, officially from natural causes. But her research notes found their way to people who understood their significance. People who recognized that the door opened in 1983 was never properly closed. The entities are still out there, waiting in the spaces between thoughts, between dimensions, between the spaces where reality grows thin. And sometimes, late at night when the electromagnetic fields are just right, they push through into our world. Not permanently, not yet, but enough to remind us that consciousness projection works both ways. We opened a door to their realm, and now they're working on opening a permanent gateway to ours. The facility in Montana still exists, buried beneath layers of concrete and classification levels that most government officials don't even know exist. Officially, the site is listed as an environmental monitoring station. But satellite imagery shows electromagnetic signatures that correspond to massive power consumption, and seismographic equipment detects rhythmic pulses that suggest something is being contained rather than monitored. Something that grows stronger every year. Something that's still connected to the consciousness of David Morrison and the dozens of other test subjects whose minds were expanded beyond human limitations. Something that's still learning about our reality, still planning its full manifestation in our dimension. The truth about Project Mindbridge will never be officially acknowledged. Too many careers, too many institutions, too many fundamental assumptions about reality would be destroyed by public revelation. But the research continues in facilities whose locations are known only to a handful of people whose names appear in no public records. And sometimes, just sometimes, new patients appear in psychiatric hospitals across America. Patients who speak of seeing through walls between dimensions, who describe entities waiting in the spaces between thoughts. Patients whose minds have been touched by something that should never have been awakened. They're usually diagnosed with schizophrenia or delusional disorders. Their stories are dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. But their brain scans show patterns that don't match any known psychiatric condition. Electromagnetic signatures that suggest their consciousness is operating on frequencies that human brains weren't designed to access. These patients are the canaries in the coal mine, early warning signs that the door opened at Project Mindbridge is still functioning, still allowing things to slip through from dimensions where consciousness is the fundamental force of reality. And one day, when the conditions are right and the barriers between dimensions grow thin enough, those things will stop slipping through one at a time. They'll come through in numbers that will change the nature of human existence forever. The people who know the truth are waiting for that day. Some of them are preparing to fight it. Others have decided to welcome our new interdimensional neighbors. But all of them agree on one thing. When it happens, the world as we know it will end. And it all started in a hospital that officially never existed, with experiments that were never conducted, creating doorways that were never opened. Remember that the next time you hear about breakthrough research in consciousness studies or experimental treatments for psychiatric conditions, ask yourself whether the researchers really understand what they're dealing with or whether they're about to repeat the mistakes of Project Mindbridge. Because the entities waiting in the spaces between dimensions learned patience long before humanity learned to think. And they're still waiting for someone to open the door wide enough for them to come through. And when they do, the world will never be the same. Deep in the heart of Massachusetts stands a Gothic monstrosity that once housed the most disturbed minds in New England. Danvers State Hospital, opened in 1878, was designed to be a beacon of hope for mental health treatment. Instead, It became a chamber of horrors that would make even the most hardened skeptic believe in the supernatural. The building itself seems to breathe malevolence. Towering brick walls stretch toward the sky like fingers grasping for something just out of reach. The windows, most now boarded up, once served as the only connection between the patients inside and the world they would never rejoin. But it's what happened within those walls that transformed Danvers into one of America's most haunted locations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell thought she had seen everything during her 30-year career in psychiatry. She had worked in maximum security facilities, dealt with violent patients, and witnessed the darkest corners of the human mind. But nothing prepared her for what she would experience during the final months before Danvers closed its doors in 1992. It was October 15, 1991. Dr. Mitchell had volunteered to work the night shift to help with the transition of patients to other facilities. The hospital was operating with a skeleton crew, and most of the building had already been emptied. She was making her final rounds in Ward C, a section that had housed the most severe cases, when she heard it. A voice, clear as day, calling her name from the end of the hallway. "Sarah," the voice whispered, drawing out each syllable like a dying breath. "Sarah, help me." Dr. Mitchell froze. She knew every patient in the building, and they were all accounted for in the secured wing 3 floors below. The voice was coming from room 237, a room that had been empty for 6 months. She grabbed her flashlight and slowly walked toward the source of the voice, her footsteps echoing ominously in the hollow corridor. As she approached room 237, the temperature dropped so dramatically that she could see her breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The voice came again, more urgent this time. "Sarah, don't leave me here. Don't let them take me to the basement." Her hand trembling, Dr. Mitchell pushed open the door to room 237. The room was empty except for an old metal bed frame and restraints that hung from the walls like dead snakes. But in the corner, barely visible in the beam of her flashlight, she saw something that made her blood freeze in her veins. There, huddled in the corner, was the translucent figure of a young woman in a hospital gown. Her hair was matted and wild, her eyes sunken and desperate. The apparition looked directly at Dr. Mitchell and spoke in a voice filled with decades of anguish. "They said I was crazy," the spirit whispered. "They said I needed treatment, but they just wanted to experiment on me. They took me to the basement, Sarah. They did things to me down there that no human being should ever endure. And when I died, they buried me in the unmarked graves behind the building. But my spirit couldn't rest. Not with what they did to me." Dr. Mitchell later learned that room 237 had been occupied by Margaret Hayes, a 19-year-old woman who had been committed by her family in 1923 for what would now be recognized as postpartum depression. Margaret had been subjected to experimental treatments including ice baths, electroshock therapy, and lobotomy procedures that were considered cutting-edge at the time but were actually forms of torture. The basement the spirit mentioned was real. It was where the most extreme procedures were performed, away from the prying eyes of inspectors and family members. Records showed that over 300 patients had died at Danvers, many under mysterious circumstances, and their bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the hospital grounds. But Margaret's spirit wasn't finished with Dr. Mitchell. Over the following weeks, as the doctor worked to close the facility, she encountered Margaret multiple times. The spirit would appear in mirrors, warning Dr. Mitchell about other patients who had suffered similar fates. She would manifest in empty rooms, always pointing toward the basement, as if trying to lead someone to uncover the truth about what had happened there. The most terrifying encounter came on Dr. Mitchell's final night at Danvers. She was collecting the last of her files from her office when every light in the building suddenly went out. In the complete darkness, she heard footsteps coming from all directions. Not just Margaret's footsteps, but dozens of them. The spirits of every patient who had died within those walls were converging on her location. The temperature plummeted to below freezing, and Dr. Mitchell's breath came out in sharp puffs as voices began whispering from every direction. "Tell them what happened here," the voices pleaded. "Don't let them forget about us. Don't let them pretend we never existed." When the lights flickered back on, Dr. Mitchell found herself surrounded by the ghostly figures of former patients. Men and women of all ages, all wearing the same desperate expressions, all reaching out to her with translucent hands. They stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds before slowly fading away, leaving Dr. Mitchell alone with the weight of their stories. Today, most of Danvers State Hospital has been demolished and replaced with luxury condominiums. But locals report that the new residents frequently experience unexplained phenomena. Voices calling for help in the middle of the night, figures in hospital gowns walking through their living rooms, and always the sound of footsteps in the basement, even in buildings that don't have basements. The spirits of Danvers refuse to be silenced, and Margaret Hayes continues to appear to anyone who will listen, still pointing toward where the basement used to be, still demanding that someone uncover the truth about what really happened in those underground chambers. But Margaret's story is just the beginning. Our journey into America's most haunted hospitals is far from over, and the next stop on our terrifying tour will take us to a place where the boundary between healing and horror became forever blurred. Hidden in the rolling hills of Newtown, Connecticut, where autumn leaves whisper secrets of the past and winter winds carry voices that should have been silenced decades ago, stands the Gothic nightmare known as Fairfield Hills Hospital. Built in 1931 as a progressive mental health facility, this sprawling complex of red brick buildings was designed to house 4,000 patients in what administrators promised would be humane conditions. Instead, it became a laboratory for medical horrors that continued long after the hospital's official closure in 1995. The hospital's most infamous resident was Dr. Edmund Blackwood, a surgeon whose obsession with the human brain led him down increasingly dark paths of experimentation. Dr. Blackwood believed that mental illness could be cured through precise surgical intervention, and he performed over 3,000 lobotomies during his 30-year tenure at Fairfield Hills. What made his procedures different from standard lobotomies was his conviction that he could improve upon the technique, that he could carve away madness while leaving the soul intact. He was wrong about many things, but he was right about one. Some souls refused to let go. It was maintenance worker James Rodriguez who first encountered Dr. Blackwood's continuing practice in the winter of 2003, 8 years after the hospital had been officially abandoned. James had been hired by the town to secure the buildings and prevent vandalism while they decided the complex's fate. He thought he was protecting empty ruins. He discovered he was the unwitting assistant to a surgeon who refused to accept that his work was finished. James arrived for his evening shift on a January night when snow fell like ash from a leaden sky. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he unlocked the main administration building. The complex consisted of dozens of interconnected structures spread across nearly 200 acres, but James had learned to focus on the main buildings where vandalism was most likely to occur. The administration building felt like a tomb as James made his rounds, checking windows and doors for signs of forced entry. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, bouncing off walls that had once been filled with the sounds of human activity. Now there was only silence and the faint smell of disinfectant that seemed to seep from the very foundations of the building. It was as James reached the medical wing that he first noticed the light. A pale, flickering glow was coming from beneath the door of what had once been Operating Room 3. James felt his pulse quicken as he approached the door. The building had been without electricity for years, and he had checked every room in this wing dozens of times over the past 6 months. There was no possible source for artificial light. James pressed his ear to the door and heard something that made his blood run cold. The steady beep of a heart monitor, punctuated by the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. Medical equipment that had been removed from the building years ago was somehow functioning again, keeping pace with procedures that should not have been possible. And underneath those mechanical sounds, he heard a voice. Calm, professional, and utterly focused. The voice of a surgeon deep in concentration, speaking to an unseen assistant about incision points and tissue removal. The voice belonged to Dr. Edmund Blackwood, who had been dead for 15 years. James tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The room beyond should have been empty, stripped of equipment and furniture like every other space in the abandoned hospital. Instead, he found himself looking into a fully functional operating theater, complete with surgical lights, monitoring equipment, and a patient lying unconscious on the operating table. Dr. Blackwood stood over the patient, his surgical mask pulled up and his eyes focused on the open skull before him. He was exactly as James had seen him in old photographs, a tall man with silver hair and surgeon's hands that moved with practiced precision. He wore surgical scrubs that should have been stained with decades of decay but appeared freshly laundered. The patient on the table was a woman, middle-aged, with the gaunt features of someone who had spent years in institutional care. Her skull had been opened with surgical precision, and Dr. Blackwood was carefully probing her exposed brain tissue with a long, thin instrument. The heart monitor showed a steady rhythm, the ventilator breathed for her, and everything about the scene suggested a routine medical procedure. Except the woman had been dead for 25 years. James recognized her from old patient files he had seen while securing the records room. Margaret Sullivan, admitted in 1967 for severe depression, had died during one of Dr. Blackwood's experimental procedures in 1978. Yet here she was, breathing steadily under anesthesia while the surgeon who had killed her continued his work. Dr. Blackwood looked up from his patient and smiled at James with the warm expression of a physician greeting a colleague. "Ah, James," he said, as if they had worked together for years. "Perfect timing. I could use an extra pair of hands for this procedure. Mrs. Sullivan has been particularly challenging, but I believe we're making real progress toward isolating the source of her melancholia." James tried to speak but found his voice trapped in his throat. The impossibility of what he was witnessing had short-circuited his ability to process rational thought. Dr. Blackwood continued his work, narrating his actions with the same clinical precision he had used during his living years. The key to successful psychosurgery, he explained, is understanding that the mind is simply another organ that can be repaired through proper technique. These patients come to us broken, damaged by experiences that have corrupted their neural pathways. Our job is to remove the corruption while preserving the essential humanity underneath. Dr. Blackwood's instrument moved deeper into Margaret's brain tissue, and she began to convulse despite the restraints holding her to the table. Her eyes flew open, staring directly at James with an expression of terror and pleading that burned itself into his memory. Her mouth moved as if she was trying to scream, but the ventilator prevented any sound from emerging. "Almost there," Dr. Blackwood murmured, his attention focused entirely on his work. "I can see the damaged tissue, the neural scarring that has been causing her emotional distress. Just a few more precise cuts and she'll be free of the depression that has plagued her for so long." But as he made his final incision, Margaret's heart monitor flatlined. The steady beeping became a shrill alarm that filled the operating room with electronic screaming. Dr. Blackwood stepped back from the table, pulling off his surgical gloves with obvious frustration. "Unfortunate," he said, shaking his head sadly. "I was so close to a breakthrough, but that's the nature of experimental medicine. Some procedures require multiple attempts before we achieve the desired outcome." He turned to James with the same warm smile, as if the death of his patient was merely a minor setback. "Don't worry about Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "She'll be back tomorrow night and we'll try a slightly different approach." The beauty of working here is that our patients are remarkably resilient. Death is just another symptom to be treated. James found his voice and his courage at the same moment. "She's been dead for 25 years, he whispered. "You killed her in 1978. You're dead too. This isn't real." Dr. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something cold and alien flickered behind his eyes. "Reality is a matter of perspective, James," he said. "From where I stand, I'm simply continuing important research that was interrupted by bureaucratic interference. These patients need my help, and I refuse to abandon them just because some administrator decided to close our facility." The operating room began to fade around the edges, becoming translucent and insubstantial. But Dr. Blackwood remained solid and present, his attention already turning back to his patient. Margaret's body was dissolving like morning mist, but her eyes remained fixed on James, still pleading for help that would never come. "I'll see you tomorrow night," Dr. Blackwood called as James stumbled toward the door. "Bring a stronger stomach next time. The work we're doing here requires dedication and the ability to see beyond conventional limitations." James ran through the empty corridors of Fairfield Hills Hospital, not stopping until he reached his truck in the parking lot. He sat behind the wheel for 20 minutes, trying to convince himself that what he had witnessed was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But when he looked back at the medical wing, he could see the pale glow of surgical lights still burning in operating room 3. James never returned to Fairfield Hills Hospital. He quit his job the next morning without explanation and moved his family to another state within a month. The town hired a new maintenance worker, but that person lasted only 3 nights before reporting strange lights and sounds coming from the medical wing. 7 more workers tried to maintain the facility over the next 2 years. None of them stayed longer than a week. The town eventually decided to demolish the most problematic buildings, but the operating room where Dr. Blackwood continues his work was left standing. Local contractors refused to enter the medical wing, claiming their equipment malfunctioned whenever they got near the surgical suite. Fairfield Hills Hospital stands partially demolished now, a maze of ruins and surviving structures that local residents avoid after dark. But the medical wing remains intact, and on clear nights when the wind is still, people passing by report seeing surgical lights burning in windows that should be dark and empty. Dr. Blackwood continues his eternal practice, convinced that he's on the verge of a medical breakthrough that will revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. His patients return night after night, enduring procedures that killed them decades ago, trapped in a cycle of surgical horror that has no end. Margaret Sullivan still pleads for help with eyes that reflect surgical lights, still hoping that someone will have the courage to stop the surgeon who refuses to let death interrupt his work. In the Pine Barrens of central New Jersey, where ancient trees create corridors of shadow even in broad daylight, and the air itself seems heavy with unspoken secrets, looms the abandoned hulk of Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital. Built in 1876 as the New Jersey State Asylum for the Insane, this massive structure was once the largest building in the United States, a Victorian monster of red brick and Gothic arches that housed over 7,000 patients at its peak. When it finally closed in 2008, it left behind more than just empty rooms and forgotten medical equipment. It left behind an entire population of souls who had never truly been allowed to live. The hospital's history reads like a catalog of psychiatric horrors. Overcrowding, understaffing, and experimental treatments that bordered on torture created conditions that would have been considered inhumane for animals, let alone vulnerable human beings. Patients were routinely subjected to ice baths, prolonged restraint, and surgical procedures designed to make them more manageable rather than to heal their conditions. The mortality rate was staggering, with an estimated 15,000 people dying within its walls over the course of its 132-year operation. But the most tragic aspect of Greystone Park wasn't the deaths. It was the lives that were never lived. Patients committed for minor behavioral issues found themselves trapped in a system that had no interest in rehabilitation or release. They aged and died in the hospital, forgotten by families who had signed them away and ignored by a society that preferred not to acknowledge their existence. It was social worker Linda Morrison who discovered that some of those forgotten souls were still waiting to be remembered. Linda had volunteered to help catalog patient records before the building's demolition, hoping to reunite families with the histories of relatives who had vanished into the psychiatric system decades ago. She thought she was working with paper files and computer databases. She found herself serving as a bridge between the living and the dead. Linda arrived at Greystone Park on a gray October morning in 2009, 6 months after the hospital's official closure. The building stretched for nearly a quarter mile, its Gothic towers and endless rows of windows creating the impression of a medieval fortress built to contain nightmares. The main entrance still bore the hospital's original name, carved in stone letters that had watched over a century of human suffering. The administrative wing where Linda set up her workspace felt like a mausoleum. Patient files filled dozens of rooms, stacked in boxes that represented thousands of individual tragedies. Each file told a story of someone who had entered Greystone Park as a person with hopes and dreams and had been reduced to a case number and a list of symptoms. As Linda worked through the records, she began to notice patterns that disturbed her professional sensibilities. Patients admitted for grief after losing a spouse found themselves diagnosed with chronic melancholia and never released. Women who showed signs of independence or intelligence were labeled as suffering from hysteria and subjected to treatments designed to break their spirits. Children as young as 10 were committed for behavioral problems that would be considered normal childhood development by modern standards. But it was the discharge records that revealed the true horror of Greystone Park. Of the thousands of patients admitted over the decades, the vast majority had only one form of discharge listed in their files: death. They had entered the hospital as living human beings and left only as statistics in a mortality register. It was as Linda worked late into her third evening at the hospital that she first heard the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible conversations that seemed to drift through the empty corridors like autumn wind. Linda attributed the sounds to the building's acoustics and the psychological effect of spending hours surrounded by tragic histories. Old buildings made strange noises, and her mind was naturally processing the emotional weight of the stories she was reading. But as the voices grew clearer and more distinct, Linda began to understand that she wasn't hearing random building sounds. These were human voices, engaged in conversations that had been cut short decades ago. Patients talking to family members who had never visited. People pleading for release from doctors who had stopped listening. The sound of human beings desperately trying to maintain their identities in a system designed to erase individuality. Linda followed the voices deeper into the hospital, leaving her workspace and entering the patient wards for the first time. The long corridors were lined with doors that opened onto tiny rooms, each barely large enough for a single bed and a small dresser. Many of the rooms still contained the remnants of personal belongings, photographs and letters and small mementos that represented someone's entire connection to the outside world. As she walked through the wards, Linda began to see them. They appeared as translucent figures moving through the hallways with the shuffling gait of heavily medicated psychiatric patients. Some wore hospital gowns that flickered between present-day transparency and solid reality. Others were dressed in the street clothes they had worn when first admitted, clothing styles that spanned nearly a century of changing fashions. But what struck Linda most powerfully wasn't their ghostly appearance. It was their eyes. Every spirit she encountered looked at her with desperate hope, as if she represented the first person who had truly seen them in decades. They reached toward her with gestures that spoke of profound loneliness, of souls who had been ignored and forgotten for so long that they had begun to doubt their own existence. An elderly woman in a faded floral dress approached Linda with slow, careful steps. Her hair was styled in the fashion of the 1940s, and her face bore the gaunt features of someone who had spent years under institutional care. She smiled with heartbreaking sweetness and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through dry leaves. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her words carrying the careful politeness of someone who had been taught that courtesy might earn better treatment. "I'm waiting for my daughter to visit. The nurses said she would come on Sunday, but I think I might have lost track of what day it is. Could you tell me what day it is?" Linda felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked at this woman who had clearly been dead for decades but was still waiting for a visit that would never come. She checked the woman's appearance against her memory of the patient files and realized she was speaking with Eleanor Whitman, admitted in 1943 for depression following her husband's death in World War II. Eleanor had died in 1967, still waiting for her daughter to visit. "It's Sunday," Linda whispered, unable to bring herself to shatter this woman's hope with the truth about how much time had passed. "Your daughter will be here soon." Eleanor's face brightened with joy that was almost unbearable to witness. "Oh, wonderful," she said, clapping her hands together like a child. "I have so much to tell her. I've been practicing my needlepoint, and I learned a new song on the piano. Do you think she'll be proud of me?" Before Linda could respond, more spirits began to gather around her. Patients from every era of the hospital's operation, all carrying the same desperate hope that someone had finally come to acknowledge their existence. They spoke over each other in their eagerness to be heard, telling stories of treatments they had endured, families they missed, and dreams they had never been allowed to pursue. A young man who couldn't have been more than 20 approached Linda with the jerky movements of someone whose medication had caused permanent neurological damage. His file identified him as Thomas Chen, admitted in 1962 for what would now be recognized as autism spectrum disorder. He had died in 1971 after developing an infection from a surgical procedure designed to make him more compliant. "They said I was broken," Thomas told Linda, his words slurred but his intelligence clearly intact. "They said my mind worked wrong and needed to be fixed. But I wasn't broken. I just saw the world differently. I could have learned. I could have contributed something, but they never gave me the chance." More spirits pressed forward, each with their own story of truncated potential and stolen futures. Linda found herself overwhelmed by the sheer weight of so much accumulated suffering. So many lives that had been reduced to medical case studies rather than being recognized as human beings with inherent worth and dignity. But the most heartbreaking encounter came when Linda met a group of children who had died in the hospital's pediatric ward. They appeared as they had been at the time of their deaths, ranging in age from 8 to 16, all wearing hospital gowns that seemed too large for their small frames. They gathered around Linda like flowers turning toward sunlight, desperate for adult attention that didn't involve medical procedures or behavioral modification. "Are you our new teacher?" asked a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. "The old teacher went away and never came back. We've been waiting for lessons. We want to learn to read and write and do arithmetic. We want to be smart like other children." Linda knelt down to the girl's level, her heart breaking at the sight of this child who had been denied even the most basic education during her short life. The file records had shown that children in the pediatric ward were often considered uneducable, left to spend their days in empty rooms with no stimulation or learning opportunities. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Linda asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The girl's face lit up with joy at being asked such a basic question about her identity. "I'm Mary," she said proudly. "Mary Elizabeth Kowalski. I'm 10 years old and I like stories about princes and princesses. Do you know any stories like that?" Linda spent the next hour telling stories to the gathered spirits, sharing tales of adventure and heroism with souls who had never been allowed to experience childhood wonder. As she spoke, more spirits gathered from throughout the hospital, drawn by the sound of human compassion that had been absent from their lives for so long. But as the night grew deeper, Linda began to understand that her presence was having an unexpected effect on the spirits of Greystone Park. They were becoming more solid, more present, as if her acknowledgement of their existence was giving them renewed strength. The hospital itself seemed to pulse with increasing energy, as if 15,000 forgotten souls were awakening from decades of dormancy. Eleanor Whitman approached Linda again, her form more solid than before. "Dear," she said, her voice stronger and more urgent, "I don't think my daughter is coming today after all. I think perhaps she's forgotten about me. Everyone seems to have forgotten about us. But you remember, don't you? You see us?" Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I see you," she whispered. "I remember you. You're not forgotten." The words seemed to release something in the gathered spirits, a collective sigh of relief that echoed through the abandoned hospital like wind through a forest. One by one, the spirits began to fade, not disappearing entirely but retreating back into whatever space they had occupied during their long wait to be acknowledged. Eleanor was the last to go, her form becoming translucent as she smiled at Linda with profound gratitude. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice growing faint. "Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for remembering that we were people, not just patients. We can rest now, knowing that someone cared enough to listen to our stories." Linda finished her work at Greystone Park over the following weeks, but she never again encountered the spirits who had gathered around her that night. The building felt different, quieter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its Gothic towers and endless corridors. She published her research on the hospital's patient population, bringing attention to the thousands of individuals who had been forgotten by history. Families came forward to claim the stories of relatives who had vanished into the psychiatric system, and memorial services were held for those who had died without anyone to mourn their passing. Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital was demolished in 2015, its Gothic towers finally brought down by explosives and heavy machinery. But local residents report that on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the pine barrens where the hospital once stood, you can still hear the sound of voices. Not the desperate pleas for help that once echoed through its corridors, but something different. The sound of people finally being heard, of souls at peace knowing that their stories have been preserved and their humanity has been acknowledged. Linda Morrison continues her work helping families research relatives who were lost in America's psychiatric system. She never speaks publicly about her encounters with the spirits of Greystone Park, but those who know her say that experience changed her understanding of what it means to truly see and acknowledge the humanity in every person, living or dead. In the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, lies the ruins of what was once one of America's largest psychiatric facilities. Eloise Psychiatric Hospital began as a poorhouse in 1839, but by the early 1900s, it had evolved into a sprawling complex of buildings that housed not just the mentally ill, but also orphans, the elderly, and anyone else that society had deemed undesirable. At its peak, Eloise housed over 10,000 residents, making it larger than many small cities. But it was the children's ward at Eloise that created the most disturbing legacy of supernatural activity. Hundreds of children, some as young as 3 years old, were housed in conditions that would be considered inhumane even by the standards of the time. Many of these children weren't even mentally ill. They were simply orphans or children from families too poor to care for them. Yet they were subjected to the same experimental treatments and abuse as the adult patients. The children's ward was located in Building D, a 3-story brick structure that was separated from the main hospital complex by a courtyard filled with unmarked graves. The building was designed to house 200 children, but records show that at times it held over 800. Children were crammed into rooms with no heat in the winter and no ventilation in the summer. Disease ran rampant, and death was so common that the staff stopped keeping accurate records of how many children died there. Sarah Coleman began working as a nurse at Eloise in 1934, specifically assigned to the children's ward. She was young and idealistic, believing she could make a difference in the lives of these forgotten children. What she discovered during her 5 years at the facility would haunt her for the rest of her life and create a supernatural encounter that defied all logic and reason. Sarah's first indication that something was wrong at Eloise came during her second week on the job. She was working the night shift in Building D when she heard children laughing and playing in the recreation room. This wouldn't have been unusual, except that it was 3 in the morning, and all the children were supposed to be asleep in their beds. Sarah went to investigate, expecting to find a group of children who had snuck out of their rooms. Instead, she found the recreation room empty. But the sounds of children playing continued, seeming to come from all around her. She could hear their voices clearly, calling to each other, laughing at some game she couldn't see. The sounds were so real, so vivid, that Sarah actually looked under tables and behind furniture, thinking the children might be hiding. When she mentioned the incident to other staff members the next day, they just exchanged knowing glances. "The children play at night," explained Mrs. Henderson, an older nurse who had been working at Eloise for 15 years. "They've been doing it for as long as I can remember. The living children sleep, but the dead ones come out to play." Sarah was skeptical at first, but over the following weeks, she began to notice other strange occurrences. Toys would appear in the recreation room, even though all toys were supposed to be locked away at night. Children's handprints would appear on windows and walls, sometimes in places that would be impossible for living children to reach. And always, there were the sounds of children playing in empty rooms. The first time Sarah actually saw one of the ghostly children, she was making her rounds on the second floor of Building D. She was checking on a particularly ill child named Tommy Morrison, a 6-year-old boy who had been brought to Eloise after his parents died in a car accident. Tommy was suffering from pneumonia, and Sarah was concerned that he might not make it through the night. As she approached Tommy's bed, she saw another child sitting beside him. The child appeared to be a girl of about 8, with long blonde hair and wearing a white nightgown. She was holding Tommy's hand and singing to him in a soft, sweet voice. Sarah assumed it was one of the other patients who had somehow gotten out of her room. "Excuse me, sweetie," Sarah said softly, not wanting to startle the girl. "You need to return to your bed now. It's way past bedtime." The girl looked up at Sarah, and what Sarah saw made her heart stop. The child's face was pale and translucent, and her eyes held a wisdom that no 8-year-old should possess. But more disturbing than the girl's ghostly appearance was the sense of overwhelming sadness that emanated from her. "Tommy is scared," the ghost child said in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "He doesn't understand why he's sick, why his parents aren't coming for him. I'm trying to comfort him." Sarah looked down at Tommy and realized that the boy was indeed calmer than she had seen him in days. His breathing was easier, and the expression of terror that had been on his face for weeks was gone. The ghost child's presence was somehow providing him with the comfort that no living person had been able to give. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, afraid to speak too loudly and break whatever spell was keeping Tommy peaceful. "My name is Emma," the ghost child replied. "I died here 2 years ago, pneumonia just like Tommy. But I couldn't leave, not when there are so many children here who are scared and alone. So I stay, and I try to help them when they're dying." Over the following months, Sarah encountered Emma dozens of times. The ghost child would appear whenever one of the patients was critically ill, always providing comfort and reassurance in their final moments. But Emma wasn't alone. Sarah gradually became aware that Building D was home to dozens of ghostly children, all of whom had died at Eloise and chosen to stay behind to help the living children. There was Michael, a 10-year-old boy who had died during an experimental brain surgery. He would appear to children who were scheduled for medical procedures, explaining what would happen and helping them not to be afraid. There was Lucy, a 5-year-old girl who had died of starvation, who would sit with children during mealtimes and encourage them to eat. And there was David, a teenager who had died after being subjected to electroshock therapy, who would appear to older children and warn them about which staff members to avoid. But the most disturbing encounters involved a ghost child named Peter. Unlike the other spirits, who seemed focused on helping the living children, Peter was filled with rage and hatred. He had died at Eloise in 1927, after being subjected to a series of experimental procedures that had been designed to cure his autism. The procedures had been incredibly painful and had ultimately killed him, leaving his spirit consumed with anger at the adults who had tortured him. Sarah's first encounter with Peter occurred on a night when Dr. Robert Kellerman was scheduled to perform experimental surgery on a 7-year-old autistic boy named James. Dr. Kellerman was known for his brutal approach to treating childhood mental disorders, and Sarah had always been uncomfortable with his methods. As Dr. Kellerman prepared James for surgery, the temperature in the operating room suddenly dropped to below freezing. Everyone's breath became visible, and frost began forming on the surgical instruments. Then, without warning, the lights went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. In the darkness, they heard a child's voice, but this voice was different from Emma's gentle tones. This voice was filled with rage and promised violence. "Don't you dare touch him," the voice screamed. "Don't you dare do to him what you did to me." When the emergency lighting finally kicked in, they saw him. Peter stood between Dr. Kellerman and the operating table, his small ghostly form radiating an anger so intense that it seemed to distort the air around him. His face was a map of surgical scars, evidence of the experimental procedures that had killed him decades earlier. Dr. Kellerman, despite his reputation for coldness, was visibly shaken. He tried to continue with the procedure, but every time he approached the operating table, the surgical instruments would fly off the tray and crash into the walls. The anesthesia machine malfunctioned. The lights flickered on and off. And through it all, Peter's spirit stood guard over young James, protecting him with a fury that transcended death itself. Finally, Dr. Kellerman gave up and postponed the surgery indefinitely. James was returned to his room, unharmed but unaware of how close he had come to suffering the same fate that had befallen Peter decades earlier. From that night forward, whenever Dr. Kellerman attempted to perform experimental procedures on children, Peter's spirit would manifest, creating chaos until the doctor was forced to abandon his plans. Sarah realized that the ghost children of Eloise had formed their own supernatural community, one dedicated to protecting the living children from the horrors they themselves had endured. Emma and the gentle spirits provided comfort and companionship, while Peter and others like him acted as guardians, using their rage as a weapon against anyone who would harm the innocent. But the most heartbreaking encounter Sarah had with the ghost children occurred during her final month at Eloise. A new patient had arrived, a 4-year-old girl named Annie who had been found wandering the streets of Detroit after her mother abandoned her. Annie was terrified, unable to speak, and refused to let anyone touch her. Sarah was assigned to care for Annie, and she quickly realized that the child had been severely abused before arriving at Eloise. Annie would cower whenever an adult approached her, and she would scream if anyone tried to examine her injuries. The staff was discussing whether to sedate Annie or use restraints to keep her manageable when something extraordinary happened. Emma appeared to Annie during the child's first night at Eloise. Sarah watched from the doorway as the ghost child materialized beside Annie's bed and began speaking to her in a soft, soothing voice. Unlike the other adults who had tried to help Annie, Emma didn't try to touch her or force her to respond. She simply sat there, telling Annie stories and singing lullabies. Gradually, Annie began to relax. She stopped screaming when adults entered her room. She allowed Sarah to examine her injuries and provide medical treatment. And slowly, she began to speak, though only to Emma at first. Sarah would often find the two children together, the living and the dead, sharing conversations that no adult was privileged to hear. Through Emma, Sarah learned the details of Annie's abuse. The child had been used as a subject for illegal medical experiments by a group of doctors who were testing new psychiatric medications on children. Annie's mother had sold her to these doctors for money, and Annie had spent months being injected with experimental drugs that caused seizures, hallucinations, and intense physical pain. Emma's spirit had recognized the signs of medical abuse because she had experienced similar treatment before her death. She became Annie's protector and advocate, helping the child heal from trauma that no 4-year-old should ever have to endure. But more than that, Emma gave Annie something that no living person could provide: the understanding of someone who had suffered the same type of abuse. Sarah's final encounter with the ghost children came on her last night at Eloise. She was making her final rounds when she found herself in the recreation room, surrounded by dozens of ghostly children. They had gathered to say goodbye to her, and their collective presence created an atmosphere of both profound sadness and overwhelming love. Emma stepped forward as the spokesperson for the group. "Thank you for seeing us," she said, her translucent form shimmering in the moonlight that streamed through the windows. "Thank you for believing in us and for helping us protect the living children. Most adults pretend we don't exist, but you listened to us." Other ghost children came forward, each one thanking Sarah for something different. Michael thanked her for always explaining medical procedures to children in terms they could understand. Lucy thanked her for making sure the children had enough to eat, even when the kitchen staff tried to cut portions. David thanked her for reporting staff members who were abusive to the patients. But it was Peter who delivered the most powerful message. His spirit approached Sarah, and for the first time, his face wasn't twisted with rage. Instead, he looked like what he was: a child who had died far too young and far too painfully. "The adults who hurt us are gone now," Peter said, his voice filled with a sadness that seemed to encompass all the children who had ever suffered at Eloise. "But we remain. We stay because there are always more children who need protection, more innocents who need someone to stand guard over them while they sleep." As Sarah left Building D for the final time, she could hear the ghost children playing in the recreation room behind her. Their laughter echoed through the empty corridors, a sound that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. The children of Eloise had found a way to transform their suffering into something beautiful, an eternal commitment to protecting others from experiencing the same horrors they had endured. Today, most of Eloise has been demolished, but Building D still stands, abandoned and slowly crumbling. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators regularly report encounters with ghost children who continue their mission of protection and comfort. Toys appear in empty rooms. Children's voices can be heard singing lullabies. And always, there is the sense that someone is watching, making sure that no child is ever alone or afraid. The spirits of Eloise prove that love can be stronger than death, and that even in the darkest places, there are those who will stand guard over the innocent. But our journey through America's most haunted hospitals has one final destination, a place where the line between medicine and madness was erased entirely, creating spirits so disturbed that they challenge our very understanding of what it means to be human. In the rolling hills of Pennsylvania stands the ruins of what was perhaps the most horrific institution in American history. Pennhurst State School and Hospital, opened in 1908, was originally designed as a progressive facility for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Instead, it became a chamber of horrors where thousands of vulnerable people were subjected to abuse so systematic and cruel that it defied human comprehension. The facility was built on the philosophy of eugenics, the belief that society could be improved by controlling human breeding and eliminating those deemed unfit. Pennhurst became a dumping ground for anyone with developmental disabilities, mental illness, or even just behavioral problems. Families were told their loved ones would receive education and care. Instead, they were signing death warrants for people whose only crime was being different. By the 1960s, Pennhurst housed over 3,000 residents in buildings designed for 600. Patients lived in their own filth, naked and ignored, tied to chairs or locked in cages barely large enough for animals. Abuse was not just tolerated but encouraged as a form of behavior modification. Staff members were known to beat residents with leather straps, force them to fight each other for entertainment, and subject them to medical experiments that served no therapeutic purpose. The conditions at Pennhurst were so horrific that when they were finally exposed in a 1968 television documentary, the footage was so disturbing that many viewers thought it was fictional. But for the residents trapped inside those walls, the nightmare was all too real. And for some of them, death was not an escape but merely the beginning of a different kind of existence. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a young physician who arrived at Pennhurst in 1975 as part of a court-ordered reform effort. She had volunteered for what she believed would be challenging but rewarding work helping to improve conditions for the residents. What she discovered during her 3 years at Pennhurst challenged everything she believed about human nature and the possibility of evil existing in pure form. Dr. Walsh's first indication that Pennhurst was haunted came during her initial tour of the facility. She was being shown through the Mayflower building, which housed the most severely disabled residents, when she heard someone calling for help from one of the rooms. The voice was weak and desperate, and it sent chills down her spine. "Someone needs help in there," Dr. Walsh told her guide, a veteran staff member named Robert Chen. "We need to check on them immediately." Robert looked at the room number and shook his head. "That room has been empty for 6 months," he said quietly. "The last resident who lived there was a young man named Danny Morrison. He died of pneumonia last winter." But Dr. Walsh could still hear the voice, clearer now and more urgent. "Help me," the voice pleaded. "Please don't leave me alone. I'm so scared." Robert noticed Dr. Walsh's expression and sighed. "You're going to hear a lot of voices here, Doctor. This place is filled with spirits of people who died here, and most of them don't understand that they're dead. They keep calling for help, just like they did when they were alive. The difference is, now there's nothing we can do to help them." Over the following weeks, Dr. Walsh began to understand the scope of the supernatural activity at Pennhurst. The facility was home to hundreds of spirits, each one representing a life that had been destroyed by the institutional cruelty that defined the place. But unlike the ghosts she had heard about in other haunted locations, these spirits weren't just residual energy or emotional imprints. They were conscious, aware, and desperate to communicate their suffering to anyone who would listen. Dr. Walsh's first direct encounter with one of Pennhurst's ghosts occurred in Building 6, which had housed children with severe developmental disabilities. She was reviewing medical files late one evening when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her office. The footsteps were strange, uneven, as if the person walking had some kind of physical disability. Dr. Walsh opened her door to see if one of the residents needed assistance, and she saw a figure at the end of the hallway. It appeared to be a child, maybe 12 years old, walking with a severe limp. The child was wearing a hospital gown that was too large for his small frame, and his head was shaved in a way that suggested recent surgery. "Excuse me," Dr. Walsh called out, thinking it might be one of the residents who had wandered away from the supervised area. "You need to return to your room now." The child turned around, and Dr. Walsh felt her heart stop. The boy's skull was partially caved in on one side, and there were surgical scars covering his scalp. But it was his eyes that truly horrified her. They held an intelligence and awareness that was unmistakably human, combined with a terror so profound that it seemed to radiate from his very soul. "My name is Timothy," the ghost child said, his voice carrying the distinctive speech patterns of someone with developmental disabilities. "They said they were going to fix my brain, make me normal, but they just kept cutting and cutting until I died on the table." Dr. Walsh later researched Timothy's case and discovered that he had been a resident at Pennhurst from 1961 until his death in 1964. His medical file revealed a horrific series of experimental brain surgeries that had been performed without the consent of his family and without any scientific basis. The surgeries had been part of a research project designed to determine whether intellectual disabilities could be cured through lobotomy procedures. Timothy's ghost appeared to Dr. Walsh repeatedly over the following months, always with the same message. "The doctors here didn't see us as human beings," he would say, his childlike voice filled with a wisdom that death had somehow granted him. "They saw us as laboratory animals, things they could experiment on without consequences. And when we died, they just moved on to the next victim." But Timothy wasn't the only spirit seeking Dr. Walsh's attention. She gradually became aware that Pennhurst was home to a vast community of the dead, all of whom had suffered similar fates during their time at the institution. There was Margaret, a teenage girl who had been sterilized against her will and died during the procedure. There was Robert, a young man who had been used as a test subject for experimental medications that caused his organs to shut down. And there was Maria, a woman who had been physically and sexually abused by staff members until she finally succumbed to her injuries. Each spirit carried with them the memory of their suffering, and their collective anguish had transformed Pennhurst into something that existed somewhere between the world of the living and a realm of pure torment. The building itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if decades of cruelty had somehow infected the very structure. The most disturbing encounter Dr. Walsh had at Pennhurst occurred in the basement of Building 14, which had been used for isolation and punishment. She had gone down to retrieve some old medical records when she heard what sounded like dozens of people crying. The sound was coming from the punishment cells, small concrete rooms where residents had been locked away for days or weeks as discipline for minor infractions. As Dr. Walsh approached the first cell, the crying grew louder and more distinct. She could make out individual voices, all calling for help, all begging to be released. When she looked through the small window in the cell door, she saw them. Dozens of ghostly figures, all crammed into a space barely large enough for one person, all reaching toward the door with desperate hands. These were the spirits of residents who had died in isolation, forgotten by the world and abandoned by the people who were supposed to care for them. Some had died of starvation when staff members forgot to feed them. Others had died of exposure when the heating was turned off during winter months. And some had simply died of despair, their will to live finally broken by the relentless cruelty they faced every day. The ghosts in the isolation cells were different from Timothy and the others Dr. Walsh had encountered. These spirits were consumed with rage, their anger so intense that it had twisted them into something barely recognizable as human. They screamed threats at anyone who came near their cells, promising vengeance against the living world that had abandoned them. But the most horrifying discovery came when Dr. Walsh found the records of what had really happened in the basement of Building 14. The isolation cells had been used not just for punishment, but for medical experiments that violated every principle of human decency. Residents had been subjected to sensory deprivation, extreme temperatures, and psychological torture that was designed to break their minds completely. One experiment, conducted in 1955, involved locking residents in the cells for months at a time with no human contact, to study the effects of complete isolation on the human psyche. Another experiment tested the limits of human endurance by gradually reducing food and water until the subjects died of starvation. The records showed that over 200 residents had died during these experiments, and their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves behind the building. Dr. Walsh's final encounter with Pennhurst's ghosts occurred on her last night at the facility. She was packing up her office when every light in the building suddenly went out. In the complete darkness, she heard footsteps coming from every direction, the sound of hundreds of people walking toward her location. When the emergency lighting came on, she found herself surrounded by the spirits of everyone who had ever died at Pennhurst. Men, women, and children, all wearing hospital gowns, all bearing the scars of the abuse they had suffered in life. They stood in perfect silence, their eyes fixed on Dr. Walsh with expressions that combined hope and desperation. Timothy stepped forward as the spokesperson for the group, just as he had done so many times before. "We need you to tell people what happened here," he said, his voice carrying the weight of all their collective suffering. "We need you to make sure the world knows that we were human beings, that we deserved love and care and dignity. Don't let them forget about us." The other spirits began to speak, one by one, each sharing their story of abuse and neglect. They talked about staff members who had beaten them for entertainment. They described medical procedures performed without anesthesia. They told of being used as test subjects for experimental drugs that caused seizures, organ failure, and death. But most heartbreaking of all, they talked about the families who had abandoned them. Parents who had been told their children would be better off at Pennhurst and never visited again. Siblings who were instructed to forget that their disabled brothers and sisters had ever existed. A society that had decided they were disposable and treated them accordingly. As dawn approached, the spirits began to fade, but their message remained clear. Pennhurst represented something more than just institutional abuse. It was a monument to humanity's capacity for evil, a place where society's most vulnerable members had been systematically tortured and murdered, while the world looked the other way. Dr. Walsh kept her promise to the spirits. She spent the rest of her career advocating for the rights of people with disabilities and working to expose the horrors that had occurred at institutions like Pennhurst. She testified before Congress, wrote articles for medical journals, and never stopped fighting to ensure that such atrocities would never happen again. Pennhurst finally closed in 1987, but the spirits remain. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators regularly report encounters with ghosts, who continue to seek justice for the crimes committed against them. Voices calling for help echo through empty buildings. Figures in hospital gowns walk the corridors where they once lived in torment. And always, there is the sense that someone is watching, waiting for the world to finally acknowledge their suffering. The ghosts of Pennhurst serve as eternal witnesses to one of the darkest chapters in American history. They remind us that evil can exist in places designed to heal, and that the most vulnerable members of society need our protection, not our neglect. Their spirits refuse to rest until the world remembers their names and acknowledges their humanity. Deep in the hollows of West Virginia, where mountain mist clings to ancient trees and shadows seem to move with a life of their own, stands the crumbling remains of Danvers State Hospital. Built in 1893, this fortress of red brick and shattered dreams housed the mentally ill for over a century before closing its doors in 2006. But the patients never left. They remained trapped in an endless cycle of treatment that was often worse than the conditions they came to cure. The hospital's reputation for brutal treatments was legendary even among psychiatric institutions of its era. Hydrotherapy, electroshock, and lobotomies were performed with reckless abandon. Patients were restrained for days, left to waste away in isolation cells barely large enough for animals. The mortality rate was staggering, with over 12,000 souls losing their lives within these walls. It was on a bitter February night in 2009 that security guard Marcus Thompson experienced something that would change his understanding of death forever. Marcus had been hired by the county to watch over the abandoned facility while they decided its fate. He thought he was guarding empty buildings. He discovered he was the guardian of a nightmare that refused to end. Marcus arrived for his midnight shift with nothing but a flashlight, a radio, and 40 years of life experience that told him ghosts were just stories people told to scare children. The wind howled through the Appalachian peaks as he unlocked the heavy front doors, the same doors that had admitted thousands of desperate families hoping their loved ones would find healing. None of them knew they were delivering their family members to a living hell. The main corridor stretched before him like a throat waiting to swallow him whole. Patient rooms lined both sides, their doors hanging open like screaming mouths. Marcus had walked this hallway dozens of times over the past 3 months. Tonight felt different. Tonight, the air itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. As he reached the halfway point of his first patrol, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was the sound of bare feet slapping against linoleum, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. The rhythm was erratic, desperate, like someone running in panic. But that was impossible. The building had been empty for 3 years. Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the walls like a gunshot. The footsteps stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. He raised his flashlight and swept the beam down the corridor. Nothing. Just empty doorways and peeling paint and the faint smell of disinfectant that somehow lingered after all these years. But then he saw her. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dying light of his flashlight, stood a woman in a hospital gown. Her hair hung in greasy strings around her face, and her bare feet were positioned as if she had been running. She stood perfectly still, staring directly at Marcus with eyes that reflected his light like a wild animal caught in headlights. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct told him to run, to get out of this place and never come back. But something about the woman's posture, the way she held herself, suggested she was as terrified as he was. Maybe she was a homeless person who had broken in seeking shelter. Maybe she needed help. He took a step forward and called out again, keeping his voice gentle and reassuring. The woman tilted her head at an angle that was too sharp, too severe for a living person. And then she smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was the rictus grin of someone whose facial muscles had locked in place during their final moments of agony. Marcus could see her teeth, yellowed and broken, and something dark that might have been blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. And then she began to move toward him. Her gait was wrong, jerky and mechanical like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. Her feet made no sound against the floor, but Marcus could hear something else now. Whispers, dozens of voices speaking in urgent, overlapping conversations that he couldn't quite understand. The voices were coming from the patient rooms, from behind every door, from the walls themselves. Marcus backed toward the entrance, his flashlight beam dancing wildly as his hands began to shake. The woman continued her impossible walk, getting closer with each passing second. As she moved through patches of moonlight streaming through broken windows, Marcus could see through her. She was translucent, flickering like a bad television signal. But the most terrifying thing wasn't that she was a ghost. It was the expression on her face. She wasn't malevolent or angry. She was desperately, pathetically hopeful, as if Marcus represented some chance for salvation that she had been waiting decades to find. When she was close enough that Marcus could smell the antiseptic and decay that surrounded her like a shroud, she stopped. She reached out with one pale hand, her fingers stretching toward him with a longing that was almost physical in its intensity. Her mouth moved, forming words that came out as barely audible whispers. "Help me," she said. "Please help me. They won't let me leave. They keep bringing me back to the room. The treatments never stop. The electricity never stops. Please make it stop." Marcus stumbled backward, his shoulder blades hitting the front doors with enough force to jar his teeth. The woman's face crumpled with disappointment, and she let out a wail of despair that seemed to come from every direction at once. The sound was joined by others, a chorus of anguish that rose from every corner of the hospital. The voices of patients who had died in agony, who had been forgotten by the world, who were trapped in an endless loop of suffering. Marcus fumbled with the door handle, his fingers numb with terror. As he finally managed to get the door open and stumbled out into the cold mountain air, he turned back for one last look. Every window in the hospital was filled with pale faces, dozens of them, all staring out at him with the same desperate hope he had seen in the woman's eyes. He never returned to Spencer State Hospital. The county found a replacement the next day, but that guard lasted only 2 nights before quitting without explanation. 7 more guards tried to work the building over the next 6 months. None of them lasted more than a week. The hospital stands empty now, officially abandoned but never truly vacant. Local residents report seeing lights moving through the building at night, hearing screams that carry on the mountain wind. The woman in the hospital gown has been seen walking the perimeter of the building, always searching, always hoping for someone who can help her escape the endless cycle of treatment that continues long after death. But Spencer State Hospital was just the beginning of our journey into medical horror. Our next destination takes us to the American Midwest, where a children's hospital became the site of unspeakable evil. Along the fog-shrouded coastline of Connecticut, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes against rocky shores with relentless fury, sits the abandoned shell of Seaside Sanatorium. Built in 1934 as a specialized facility for children suffering from tuberculosis and other respiratory ailments, this Art Deco monument to medical progress was designed to be a place of healing. Instead, it became a tomb for over 800 children whose only crime was being born into poverty during the Great Depression. The sanatorium was considered revolutionary for its time, built with large windows to let in natural light and positioned to take advantage of sea breezes that were believed to aid in recovery. What the architects didn't account for was the psychological damage inflicted by separating sick children from their families for months or years at a time. What they couldn't have predicted was how desperation would drive the medical staff to experimental treatments that bordered on torture. Dr. Elizabeth Marsh thought she understood the history when she arrived in November of 1998 to conduct a psychological study on institutional trauma. She was researching the long-term effects of childhood medical institutionalization, using Seaside as a case study in how good intentions could lead to devastating outcomes. She planned to spend 3 days reviewing medical records and documenting the physical remains of the facility. Instead, she discovered that some of the children never left. Dr. Marsh was a woman of science, armed with advanced degrees in psychology and a rational mind that had no room for supernatural explanations. She had spent her career studying the very real horrors that humans inflict on each other. She thought she was prepared for anything she might find in the abandoned sanatorium. She was wrong. The building had been empty for 23 years when Dr. Marsh arrived with her research assistant, a graduate student named Kevin Walsh. The Connecticut Department of Health had given them permission to access the facility, warning them about structural damage and potential asbestos exposure. They had not warned them about the children. The main lobby still bore traces of its former grandeur, with marble floors and Art Deco murals depicting scenes of seaside tranquility. But decades of neglect had allowed water damage and vandalism to transform beauty into decay. Mold climbed the walls like black veins, and broken glass crunched underfoot with every step. Dr. Marsh and Kevin began their work in the administrative wing, photographing patient records and cataloging the remnants of medical equipment. The files told stories of children as young as 5 years old who had been separated from their families and subjected to treatments that modern medicine would consider barbaric. Forced exposure to extreme temperatures, experimental drug trials, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia on children who were considered too poor and too sick to matter. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Marsh noticed that Kevin was becoming increasingly agitated. He kept glancing toward the patient wings, claiming he heard sounds coming from the abandoned wards. Children's voices, he said, laughter and crying and the sound of small feet running through empty corridors. Dr. Marsh attributed his nervousness to the oppressive atmosphere of the place. Old buildings had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially buildings with such tragic histories. She suggested they focus on their work and ignore any sounds that might be caused by wind or settling foundations. But as evening approached and shadows began to creep through the broken windows, Dr. Marsh began to hear the sounds herself. They were subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural acoustics of the empty building. A giggle that might have been wind whistling through a crack. A sob that could have been water dripping from a damaged pipe. The patter of small feet that might have been rats scurrying through the walls. Except rats don't sing lullabies. The singing started just as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the sanatorium in near total darkness. It was a child's voice, sweet and innocent, singing a nursery rhyme that Dr. Marsh recognized from her own childhood. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the empty halls with an ethereal quality that made her skin crawl. Kevin grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with desperate intensity. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "That's a child singing. There's a child in here with us." Dr. Marsh tried to rationalize what they were experiencing. Old buildings often carried sound in unexpected ways. The singing could be coming from outside, from a radio or television in a nearby house. But even as she formed these logical explanations, she knew they were wrong. The voice was too clear, too close, too deliberately positioned to be coming from anywhere but inside the sanatorium. And then they heard the laughter. It started as a single child's giggle, bright and joyful in a way that seemed obscene in this place of suffering. But then more voices joined in, a chorus of children's laughter that grew louder and more intense with each passing second. The sound bounced off the walls and multiplied, creating an acoustic nightmare that surrounded Dr. Marsh and Kevin like a living thing. Dr. Marsh found herself moving toward the patient wing, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain. The laughter was coming from the children's ward, from the rooms where the youngest patients had lived and died during the sanatorium's operational years. Kevin followed reluctantly, his flashlight beam dancing erratically as his hands shook with fear. The children's ward was a long corridor lined with small rooms, each barely large enough for a single bed and a small dresser. Many of the doors had been removed over the years, leaving dark openings that yawned like hungry mouths. As they walked deeper into the ward, the laughter began to fade, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse: crying. Not the dramatic wails of a child having a tantrum, but the quiet, hopeless sobbing of children who had given up hope. It was the sound of kids who had been abandoned by their families, forgotten by the world, left to die alone in sterile rooms surrounded by strangers who saw them as medical curiosities rather than human beings. Dr. Marsh stopped in front of one of the patient rooms and peered inside. Her flashlight illuminated a space that should have been empty but wasn't. Sitting on a bed that had been removed decades ago was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, wearing a faded hospital gown. Her hair was thin and patchy, her face gaunt from malnutrition and disease. She looked up at Dr. Marsh with eyes that held depths of sadness no child should ever know. The girl smiled, and Dr. Marsh felt her heart break. It was such a sweet, innocent expression, full of hope and trust despite everything this child had endured. The girl raised one skeletal hand and waved, as if greeting a beloved visitor she had been waiting years to see. Then she spoke, and her words cut through Dr. Marsh's soul like shards of glass. "Are you my mommy?" she asked. "Did you come to take me home? I've been waiting so long. The doctors said my mommy would come back for me, but she never did. Are you here to take me home?" Dr. Marsh tried to speak, but found her throat constricted with emotion. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at this impossible child, this spirit of innocence trapped forever in a place of suffering. The girl's smile began to fade as Dr. Marsh failed to respond, replaced by a look of devastating disappointment. "You're not my mommy," the girl whispered, her voice growing faint. "Nobody ever comes for us. We wait and wait, but nobody ever comes." The girl began to fade like morning mist, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. But her voice lingered, joined by other children's voices, all asking the same heartbreaking question. "Where are our mommies? Why did they leave us here? When are we going home?" Dr. Marsh stumbled backward, her professional composure shattered by what she had witnessed. As she and Kevin fled toward the exit, the voices of the children followed them, pleading for attention, for comfort, for someone to care about their fate. The sounds didn't stop until they were outside the building, gasping the cold November air like drowning people breaking the surface of the ocean. Dr. Marsh never published her study on Seaside Sanatorium. The official reports claimed that structural instability had made the building too dangerous to properly survey. But those who knew her said she was never the same after that night. She left academia shortly afterward, dedicating her life to working with living children who needed help and protection. The sanatorium still stands on its cliff overlooking the Atlantic, slowly being reclaimed by nature and time. But local residents report that on quiet nights, when the fog rolls in from the ocean, you can still hear the children singing their nursery rhymes, still waiting for parents who will never return. But the children of Seaside Sanatorium aren't the only spirits trapped by medical neglect. Our final destination takes us to the desert Southwest, where a psychiatric hospital became the setting for horrors that defied human comprehension. In the scorching desert of Arizona, where the sun beats down mercilessly and mirages dance on the horizon like spirits seeking revenge, stands the skeletal remains of Desert View Hospital. Built in 1952 as a state-of-the-art psychiatric facility, this modernist structure of concrete and glass was designed to be a beacon of hope for the mentally ill. Instead, it became the site of medical experiments so horrific that they were covered up by the federal government for over 40 years. The hospital's location was chosen specifically for its isolation. Surrounded by hundreds of miles of desert wasteland, it was the perfect place to conduct treatments that the outside world was never meant to discover. Patients sent to Desert View rarely returned home, and those who did were so traumatized that their accounts of what happened were dismissed as the ravings of disturbed minds. What made Desert View unique among American psychiatric institutions was the work of Dr. Vincent Crane, a psychiatrist whose theories on mental illness bordered on the occult. Dr. Crane believed that madness was caused by spiritual possession, that the mentally ill were being controlled by malevolent entities from another dimension. His solution was to use a combination of experimental drugs, sensory deprivation, and ritualistic procedures to drive these entities out of his patients' minds. The truth about Dr. Crane's experiments remained buried in classified government files until 2001, when paranormal investigator Sarah Chun gained access to the abandoned hospital. Sarah had made a career of debunking supernatural claims, using scientific methods to explain away ghostly encounters and paranormal phenomena. She came to Desert View expecting to find nothing more than the psychological residue of human suffering. She discovered that some horrors transcend the boundary between science and supernatural. Sarah arrived at the hospital on a blazing July afternoon when the desert temperature reached 115 degrees. The building had been abandoned for over 2 decades, its windows broken and its walls scarred by graffiti and weather damage. But the basic structure remained intact, a testament to the solid construction that had been designed to keep people in rather than keep the elements out. The main entrance led to a lobby that still retained traces of its former modernist elegance. Clean lines and minimalist design had been intended to create a calming environment for patients and families. But the empty space now felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of shattered hopes and broken promises. Sarah set up her equipment in the main treatment wing, deploying electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and digital recording devices. She had investigated dozens of supposedly haunted locations over the past 15 years, and her methods had consistently revealed mundane explanations for supernatural claims. She expected Desert View to be no different. Her first indication that this case would be unique came as the sun began to set and the desert temperature dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive. The electromagnetic readings on her equipment began to fluctuate wildly, showing energy patterns that defied conventional explanation. The infrared cameras detected heat signatures moving through empty corridors, human-shaped forms that appeared and disappeared like smoke. But it was the audio recordings that truly unsettled her. As darkness fell across the desert, Sarah's digital recorders began picking up sounds that shouldn't have existed in an empty building. Voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize, chanting rhythmic phrases that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The sound of machinery operating in rooms where no machinery existed, the whir of centrifuges and the hum of electrical equipment that had been removed decades ago. And underneath it all, the screaming. The screams were human, but barely. They spoke of pain that transcended physical suffering, of agony that reached into the very core of human consciousness and twisted it into something unrecognizable. Sarah had heard recordings of torture victims, of people experiencing the worst forms of human cruelty. These sounds were worse. They suggested suffering that continued beyond death, torment that had no end. Sarah tried to maintain her scientific objectivity, but as the night progressed, she found herself drawn deeper into the hospital's treatment wing. Her equipment readings became more erratic with each step, and the voices on her recorders grew clearer and more demanding. They were calling to her, beckoning her toward the center of the building where Dr. Crane had conducted his most extreme experiments. The treatment wing was a maze of small rooms connected by narrow corridors that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. Sarah followed her electromagnetic detector toward the strongest readings, passing rooms that still contained restraint devices and surgical equipment covered in decades of dust. The air itself seemed thick with the psychic residue of suffering, making each breath feel like swallowing liquid fear. At the center of the wing was Dr. Crane's private laboratory, a large room with reinforced walls and no windows. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed medical equipment that looked more like torture devices, machines designed to inflict precise amounts of pain and psychological trauma. Charts covered the walls, documenting experimental procedures that had been performed on unwilling subjects. But the most disturbing discovery was Dr. Crane's journal, still sitting open on a desk as if he had stepped away only moments ago. The handwritten pages detailed his descent into madness, his growing belief that his patients weren't mentally ill but spiritually contaminated. His final entries described a procedure he called the Great Cleansing, a ritual designed to permanently separate the spirit from the body. As Sarah read the journal by flashlight, she began to understand the true horror of what had happened at Desert View. Dr. Crane hadn't been treating mental illness. He had been conducting experiments in human consciousness, trying to prove that the soul could be extracted from the body through a combination of drugs, torture, and ritualistic procedures. His patients hadn't died from medical complications. They had been murdered in the name of pseudoscientific research, and according to the journal's final entry, the experiments had succeeded. Dr. Crane claimed that he had discovered a way to trap human consciousness in a state between life and death, creating beings that existed purely as spiritual energy. These entities, he wrote, were more intelligent and more powerful than living humans. They were the next step in human evolution, but something had gone wrong. The entities had turned on their creator, and Dr. Crane's final journal entry was a frantic account of his attempts to contain forces that he could no longer control. The hospital had been evacuated suddenly in 1975, with official reports claiming a gas leak. The truth was far more terrifying. As Sarah finished reading the journal, the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Her breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began to form on the metal surfaces of the abandoned medical equipment. The electromagnetic readings on her detector spiked beyond the instrument's ability to measure. And then she heard Dr. Crane's voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied sound that seemed to originate from the walls themselves. The voice was cultured and educated, with the precise diction of a man who had spent his life in academic circles. But there was something else in that voice, something that suggested the speaker was no longer entirely human. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice said, carrying undertones of amusement and menace. "This is not a place for the living. We have been waiting so long for someone with the proper understanding to appreciate our work. You've read the journal. You know what we accomplished here." Sarah tried to back toward the door, but found her path blocked by figures that materialized from the darkness. They had once been human, but their time in the space between life and death had transformed them into something else. Their faces were gaunt and elongated, their eyes burning with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. They moved with fluid grace that defied human anatomy, gliding rather than walking. The figure in the center of the group was Dr. Crane himself, or what remained of him. His white coat was stained with substances that might have been blood or might have been something worse. His face retained its human features, but they were twisted into expressions that no living person could make. When he smiled, Sarah could see that his teeth had been replaced with shards of metal and glass. "You came here seeking to debunk the supernatural," Dr. Crane said, his voice echoing inside Sarah's skull rather than reaching her through her ears. "But what if the supernatural is simply science that hasn't been properly understood? What if consciousness is just another form of energy that can be manipulated and transformed? My patients helped me prove that death is not an ending but a graduation to a higher state of being." The other figures began to circle Sarah, their movements hypnotic and predatory. She recognized some of them from the patient files she had reviewed, men and women who had been committed to the hospital for minor mental health issues and had never been seen again. They retained enough of their human appearance to be recognizable, but their eyes held depths of knowledge that no living person should possess. "You have two choices," Dr. Crane continued. "You can flee like a coward and spend the rest of your life knowing that you walked away from the greatest discovery in human history. Or you can stay and let us show you what lies beyond the veil of death. You can become part of our eternal experiment, a consciousness freed from the limitations of flesh and bone." Sarah felt her rationality cracking under the pressure of what she was experiencing. Every scientific principle she had ever believed in was being shattered by the impossible reality surrounding her. These beings were clearly dead, but they were also clearly conscious and intelligent. They were offering her a chance to transcend human limitations, to become something greater than she had ever imagined possible. For a moment, she considered accepting their offer. The promise of unlimited knowledge, of existence beyond the fear of death, was almost irresistible. But then she remembered the screams she had recorded, the evidence of suffering that had echoed through the building all night. Whatever these beings had become, they had not transcended human limitations. They had become prisoners of their own transformation, trapped forever in a state that was neither life nor death. Sarah found her voice and her courage at the same moment. "I choose to leave," she said, surprised by how steady her words sounded. "I choose to remain human with all the limitations that entails. Your experiment didn't create evolution, created damnation." Dr. Crane's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "You disappoint me," he said. "I had hoped you would have the vision to see beyond the narrow constraints of conventional mortality. But perhaps you're right. Perhaps some minds are too small to grasp the magnitude of what we've achieved here." The figures began to fade like smoke, their forms becoming translucent and insubstantial. But Dr. Crane's voice lingered, following Sarah as she stumbled toward the exit. "You'll return," he called after her. "They always return. The knowledge you've gained here will haunt you, will call to you in your dreams. Eventually, you'll come back seeking the answers that only we can provide." Sarah ran through the desert night, not stopping until she reached her car and not feeling safe until she was hundreds of miles away from Desert View Hospital. She never published her findings from that investigation, never spoke publicly about what she had experienced in the abandoned psychiatric facility. But Dr. Crane was right about one thing. The knowledge she had gained did haunt her. For the rest of her life, Sarah would wake from dreams of floating figures and impossible voices, calling her back to a place where the boundary between science and supernatural had been permanently shattered. Desert View Hospital still stands in the Arizona desert, its broken windows staring out at the endless wasteland like blind eyes. The official records claim it was abandoned due to budget cuts and changing approaches to mental health treatment. But those who know the truth understand that some experiments should never be attempted, some boundaries should never be crossed. Perched on a hill overlooking the Tennessee River, the old South Pittsburg Hospital stands as a monument to medical ambition gone terribly wrong. Built in 1959, this four-story medical facility was designed to be a state-of-the-art hospital serving the rural communities of southeastern Tennessee. Instead, it became a place where medical errors were covered up, where experimental procedures were performed without consent, and where patients who entered for routine surgeries never left alive. The hospital operated for only 39 years before closing in 1998, but during that time, it developed a reputation among locals as a place where people went to die rather than heal. The mortality rate was inexplicably high, even for procedures that should have been routine. Patients would enter for appendectomies and die of mysterious complications. Children would come in for tonsillectomies and never wake up from anesthesia. And elderly patients admitted for observation would be found dead in their rooms with no apparent cause. But what made Old South Pittsburg Hospital truly notorious was the discovery, made after its closure, of what appeared to be evidence of unauthorized medical experiments. Hidden rooms were found in the basement, equipped with surgical equipment that didn't match any known medical procedures. Medical records revealed patients who had been subjected to operations that weren't documented in their charts. And most disturbing of all, there were discrepancies between the number of patients admitted and the number who were officially discharged or died. Dr. Amanda Foster was a forensic pathologist hired by the state in 1999 to investigate the unexplained deaths that had occurred at Old South Pittsburg Hospital. She had spent her career examining suspicious deaths and had seen evidence of medical malpractice before, but nothing had prepared her for what she would discover during her 6-month investigation of the abandoned facility. Dr. Foster's first indication that the hospital was haunted came during her initial examination of the operating rooms. She was reviewing surgical equipment and patient records when she heard what sounded like a medical procedure in progress in the adjacent operating theater. She could hear the steady beep of heart monitors, the hiss of anesthesia machines, and voices discussing a surgical procedure. Thinking that someone else might be conducting an investigation, Dr. Foster went to check on the source of the sounds. When she opened the door to operating room 3, she expected to find investigators or maintenance workers. Instead, she found the room empty except for old surgical equipment covered in dust and cobwebs. But the sounds continued, seeming to come from all around her. As Dr. Foster stood in the empty operating room, the temperature suddenly dropped to below freezing. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the surgical instruments. Then she heard a voice that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Doctor," the voice said, "we're losing him. His vital signs are dropping rapidly." Dr. Foster spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but she was alone in the room. The voice came again, more urgent this time. "We need to stop the bleeding now, or we're going to lose him on the table." Then, as Dr. Foster watched in horror, she began to see ghostly figures materializing around the operating table. There was a surgeon, his hands covered in phantom blood, frantically working on a patient she couldn't see. There were nurses passing instruments and monitoring equipment that flickered in and out of existence. And lying on the operating table was the translucent form of a middle-aged man, his chest open and his life ebbing away. The ghostly surgical team worked desperately to save their patient, but Dr. Foster could tell from their increasingly frantic movements that they were losing the battle. The patient's ghostly form grew more transparent with each passing moment, until finally, the phantom heart monitor let out a long, steady tone that indicated death. That's when the most disturbing part of the vision began. Instead of stopping the procedure and declaring the patient dead, the ghostly surgical team continued working. They began removing organs from the patient's body, harvesting tissue and conducting procedures that had nothing to do with the original surgery. Dr. Foster realized she was witnessing not just a medical failure, but evidence of unauthorized organ harvesting. The lead surgeon looked up from his work, and for a moment, his eyes met Dr. Foster's. His face was twisted with madness and obsession, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible guilt. "We tried to save them," he said, his ghostly form becoming more solid as he spoke. "We really tried, but when we couldn't, we decided their deaths shouldn't be completely meaningless. We used their bodies to advance medical science, to help other patients. But we never asked permission. We never told their families what we were really doing." Dr. Foster later identified the ghostly surgeon as Dr. Richard Blackwood, who had served as the chief of surgery at Old South Pittsburg Hospital from 1975 to 1995. His medical license had been suspended twice for questionable practices, but both times he had been quietly transferred to different hospitals rather than being permanently banned from practicing medicine. Through her investigation, Dr. Foster uncovered evidence that Dr. Blackwood and his surgical team had been conducting unauthorized procedures on patients who died during surgery. They were harvesting organs for transplant without family consent, using tissue for experimental research, and conducting post-mortem procedures that were never documented in patient records. The hidden rooms in the basement had been used for these unauthorized procedures, equipped with preservation equipment and research tools that had no legitimate medical purpose. But Dr. Blackwood's spirit wasn't the only ghost haunting the operating rooms of Old South Pittsburg Hospital. Dr. Foster gradually became aware that each operating theater was home to the spirits of patients who had died under suspicious circumstances. They would manifest during her investigations, always trying to communicate what had really happened to them during their final moments. There was Martha Williams, a 45-year-old teacher who had entered the hospital for routine gallbladder surgery in 1987. Her ghost appeared to Dr. Foster in operating room 1, still wearing her hospital gown and bearing the scars of multiple incisions that hadn't been documented in her medical file. Martha's spirit explained that she had awakened during surgery to find Dr. Blackwood removing organs that had nothing to do with her gallbladder. She had tried to scream, but the anesthesia had paralyzed her vocal cords. She had died on the table, fully conscious and aware that her body was being violated. There was James Patterson, a 62-year-old farmer who had come to the hospital for a hernia repair in 1991. His ghost manifested in operating room 2, his spirit bearing evidence of surgical procedures that had never been authorized. James explained that Dr. Blackwood had used his surgery as an opportunity to conduct experimental procedures on his kidneys and liver. When complications arose from these unauthorized surgeries, James had died from organ failure, his family never knowing that his death had been the result of medical experimentation rather than surgical complications. And there was 8-year-old Susan Chun, who had been brought to the hospital for a routine tonsillectomy in 1993. Her ghost was the most heartbreaking of all. A small spirit who appeared in the pediatric operating room still clutching a stuffed animal that her parents had given her for comfort. Susan's spirit revealed that Dr. Blackwood had used her surgery to harvest tissue samples for a research project he was conducting on childhood development. The unauthorized procedures had caused massive brain trauma, leaving Susan in a vegetative state before she finally died 3 days later. Dr. Foster's most terrifying encounter at Old South Pittsburg Hospital occurred in the basement, in the hidden rooms where the unauthorized procedures had been conducted. She had gone down to examine the preservation equipment when she heard what sounded like dozens of people moaning in pain. The sounds were coming from a room marked as Storage Room C, but when Dr. Foster opened the door, she found something that nearly drove her to madness. The room was filled with ghostly figures, all of whom appeared to be patients in various states of surgical mutilation. Some were missing organs, their ghostly bodies bearing gaping wounds that would never heal. Others showed evidence of experimental procedures that had left them disfigured and in constant pain. And all of them were conscious, aware of what had been done to them, and unable to find peace in death. At the center of the room stood Dr. Blackwood's spirit, still wearing his surgical scrubs, still holding instruments that dripped with phantom blood. He was conducting a procedure on a patient whose ghostly screams filled the air, but his hands moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed the same operation hundreds of times. "We were on the verge of breakthrough discoveries," Dr. Blackwood's ghost said, noticing Dr. Foster's presence. "These patients were going to die anyway. Their deaths would have been meaningless, but we gave them purpose. We used their bodies to advance human knowledge, to develop techniques that would save future patients." The ghost patients in the room turned their attention to Dr. Foster, and their collective anguish created a vortex of emotional energy that threatened to overwhelm her sanity. They reached out to her with phantom hands, begging her to tell their families what had really happened to them. They wanted the world to know that they hadn't died from surgical complications or medical failures. They had been murdered by a doctor who saw them as research materials rather than human beings. "You have to stop him," whispered the ghost of Martha Williams, her spirit more solid than the others. "He's still operating. He's still taking patients who trust him and turning them into experiments. He's still down here, still cutting, still harvesting, still destroying lives for the sake of science." Dr. Foster realized that Dr. Blackwood's spirit was trapped in an eternal cycle of unauthorized surgery, forever conducting procedures on patients who could never be saved because they were already dead. The basement room existed outside of normal time, a place where medical horrors from different decades were happening simultaneously. But the most disturbing discovery was that Dr. Blackwood's spirit wasn't content to remain in the past. He was actively trying to influence living medical professionals, appearing to surgeons in operating rooms across the country and encouraging them to conduct unauthorized procedures on their patients. Several mysterious deaths at other hospitals had been attributed to his ghostly influence, as if he was building a supernatural network of medical murderers. Dr. Foster's investigation ultimately led to the exhumation of dozens of bodies from the hospital cemetery. The autopsies revealed evidence of unauthorized organ harvesting, experimental procedures, and surgical mutilation that confirmed the testimonies of the ghost patients. Dr. Blackwood's medical license was posthumously revoked, and several other doctors who had worked with him faced criminal charges. Today, Old South Pittsburg Hospital operates as a paranormal research center, but visitors regularly report encounters with surgical ghosts who continue their eternal operations. Operating room lights turn on by themselves. Surgical instruments move without human intervention. And always, there are the sounds of medical procedures being conducted in empty rooms. The spirits of Old South Pittsburg Hospital serve as a reminder that the trust patients place in their doctors is sacred, and that violations of that trust can create wounds that never heal, even in death. But our journey through America's most haunted hospitals continues, and our next destination will take us to a place where the maternity ward still echoes with the cries of babies who were never meant to survive.